Good afternoon and welcome to the seventh lecture in our eight-part international webinar series titled Gandhi's Legacy, Reflections and Reappraisals. We deem it an honor to have as our speaker for today's session Dr. Gautam Choubey, who's Assistant Professor in the Department of English, ARSD College, University of Delhi. uh, Dr. Choubey will be speaking to us today on a very important topic, which is titled, quote, Ascent Arrives, Impressions of Gandhi, 1915 to 1920. And I presume it will be a discussion on the way Gandhi's arrival in India, his involvement in the anti-colonial agitation in India, the way it was received, the way it was reported in periodicals, especially periodicals getting published in the Hindi heartland. And this is a topic with which Dr. Choubey has been involved, with which he has been engaging for the past 5, 6 years, if not more. And his forthcoming book, which is tentatively titled Using Mahatma, will be an exploration of this particular topic with greater breadth and depth. He is a well-known columnist, a writer, author, a researcher who has published in various journals. And he's also most recently the translator of the first Bhojpuri novel titled Phul Sungi, which was authored by Pandey Kapil. The book is scheduled to be published, that is the English translation, is scheduled to be published sometime in November 2020. Uh, I welcome Dr. Choubey, who has very kindly agreed to deliver this talk for us. On behalf of Department of English, North Odisha University, I welcome Dr. Choubey. The stage is yours now, sir. The talk will be followed by Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Sashwat, for that wonderful introduction. Uh, I also thank your university for organizing this very important lecture series. Engaging with Gandhi is important, as important now as it was at any point in history. And going by what we know of Gandhi, it's perhaps safe to assume that he'll be as important in days to come. Um, my engagement with Gandhi and some of his ideas has been, in broadly speaking, in context of my PhD dissertation, which was titled Hindi Prose and Gandhian First Principles, Issues of Community, Agency and Justice. And the objective was to try and understand how Hindi public sphere, which was responsible for formulating blueprints for India, blueprints for an India as they imagined a free nation to be. Uh, how Hindi public sphere engages with Gandhi, engages with his ideas, and how it then shapes, formulates some of these ideas, rejects some others. So basically, it was trying to understand how the Hindi public sphere, through a matrix of periodicals and books and uh, printing houses, engages with Gandhi, and through that engagement engages with the question of India. Uh, so the PhD was done and dusted. Now I'm trying to develop it into a book, tentatively titled Using Mahatma, because we're looking at the ways in which Mahatma was used by these periodicals. So use is a template that I have used as opposed to inspired or influenced, because use is a mode of engagement which Gandhi himself encouraged in his writings, in his autobiography, in his accounts of South Africa, in his other writings. We see this template which is given to us, a template which can be used to arrive at certain formulations, a template which can be used to solve certain conflicts, a template that can be used to solve even questions of personal dilemma. So I thought that use would be a template that would best explain the ways in which Hindi public sphere engages with Gandhi rather than influence or inspiration. Uh, today's lecture is titled The Mahatma Arrives, and as the title suggests, I'll be looking at Gandhi's arrival in India in 1915 and the period thereafter, a period of 5 years thereafter, what he does, and how the Hindi public sphere receives him and how the public sphere projects him. Uh, but more than that, I'm also trying to understand conditions which enable Gandhi's arrival, right? More than Gandhi's reception, of which I'll give you some examples, right? I'll give you examples of the ways in which Gandhi's arrival was preempted, and then when he comes to India in 15, how his arrival was described. I'll certainly give you some examples of that from Hindi writings, from Hindi periodicals. But more than that, I'm trying to understand the conditions, right? The conditions, the discursive conditions, which enables and anticipates the arrival of Mahatma on the political sphere. Um, and I think a good way to understand, perhaps a good way to launch into this investigation would be to look at the discussion that Gandhi has with his reader in Hindu Swaraj published in 1909 about India. And what the reader asks Gandhi as to what is it that an organization that is working for nations' emancipation, for organization, they were of course referring to Congress. So what is it that Congress ought to do? And to this question posed by the reader, the editor, Gandhi, uh, has the following three things to say. He says that the organization that claims to lead a nation into its struggle for political self realization should, number one, give expression, right? Expression to the angst of the people it claims to represent. Uh, Number two, it should try to arouse people, stir sentiments, right, towards issues which it deems relevant, it deems important, and which may not have found an articulation in the popular discontent. And number three, it should expose the government and its misrule. And while Gandhi was doing all three quite successfully in South Africa, he was engaged in arousing the small Indian community in South Africa. He was uh, he was engaged in exposing the misdeeds of the colonial rule in South Africa. He was also involved in giving expression to the anxieties and to the sense of insult which the Indians in South Africa felt on account of certain laws, uh, mainly the law about concerning registration of marriages. So he was doing all of that. But as he comes to India, in India he has to encounter a different reality. The India where he hopes to work, the India where he arrives in 1915 was radically different from South Africa. He had the experience of working with Indians in South Africa, and they were quite diverse. They were Tamils and they were Gujaratis, and then they were Bengalis as well. He had the experience of also working with Europeans sympathetic to the colonized, sympathetic to or apathetic to to imperial missions, to colonialism. So he worked with Pollock and Kallenbach. So he had those experiences. But India was a completely different territory. The social matrix in India was different. The realities in India was different. The caste difference, which could so easily vanish, disappear uh, on account of the compulsions of living in South Africa, that was very strong in India. So he had to, in a sense, redefine what an organization ought to do. And as in years to come, he became an organization unto himself. Uh, so when he comes to India, when is about to start uh, to India around 1915, uh, C.F. Andrews wrote a letter to Gokhale, and I'd like to read a portion of that letter to you, where Andrew anticipates as to what they should expect from Gandhi, as to what Gandhi is likely to do, and is Gandhi likely to follow in the footsteps of Gokhale or join the servants of Indian society, or is he likely to differ and do something radically different? And just a moment. C.F. Andrews, as we know, an associate of Gandhi, taught at Delhi's St. Stephen's College for a while. Um, yeah. This letter was written by C.F. Andrews uh, to Gokhale in December of the year that Gandhi sets out for India. And in the letter, Andrew writes, "I have been thinking a great deal about what Mr. Gandhi will do on his return. Perhaps it is no use thinking, as he is bound to take his own course, whatever it may be. He is not one who can be bound. I do feel positive about one thing, that he could not for long fit in the general work of the servants of India society. He might take up some special sphere, such as work among the depressed classes, but he would need to be quite independent. Right? So it's very clear that the methods that Gandhi had invented, if he were to continue with those methods, he had to chart his own independent course, right? Exposing or giving voice to popular sentiments or stirring the masses in the way Congress was trying to do till 1915 was not enough, given his expectations from a nationalist body, given his expectations, given his idea of what it means to lead a nationalist movement. So there was certainly going to be something different. He had to, in a sense, chart an independent course, an independent trajectory, and which he does, not by dismissing Congress, but by molding Congress. Again, a commonplace in Gandhian scholarship, how Gandhi changes that. But we can also see how Gandhi anticipates. Uh, uh, Again, in Swaraj, when the reader asks him about the working of the Congress, he has nothing. He has no radical critique to offer. Right? He's quite happy with the way Congress is working. He's quite happy with its approach. He's happy with the people who've been involved with the Congress. He's also speaks wax eloquent of the Europeans and the British who have been responsible, who've been involved with the Congress. So he doesn't offer a radical critique of the Congress and its policies or its practices. But at the same time, he suggests that the Congress should adopt Satyagraha. This is 1909 in the book. Uh, and if the Congress was to adopt Satyagraha, it had to change quite a lot. It had to change. It had to change the way it was structured, its composition, its objectives. So Gandhi was very clear, and that in 15 when he is going to India, although the objectives are clear, it's to uh, articulate, it's to expose, it's to stir, but his methods will be different. His methods will be different from the methods that Congress followed till 1915. His methods would also be different, as C.F. Andrews suspects, from the methods of Gokhale and his Servants of India Society. Uh, Now, in 1916, something very radical happens. For the first time, from the Congress platform, a peasant is allowed to speak. This is Rajkumar Shukl, the person who was after Gandhi, who chased Gandhi for many years till he relented and met him and agreed to take up the cause of the farmers in Champaran. So Rajkumar Shukla was asked to speak, and about Rajkumar Shukla, he did not have the oratory of the lawyers who spoke at these conferences. He lacked the skills of the educationist and the editors who had filled the ranks of the files of the Congress. Um, but even for somebody like him, it was very clear that uh, if the problem that he wants addressed, if the problem that he wants solved, if there's one person, if there's one individual who can address that problem, it has to be Gandhi. He was very clear about that. And so this is the structure of the. I'll just briefly spell out the structure of the paper, and then in between I'll have to read from the paper because there are so many references which I don't want to miss out on, and I'll also explain, and of course there'll be Q&A where I'll be happy to take as many questions as time permits. So this is the structure of the paper. In the first segment, I'm going to look at some of the conditions uh, that enables, that facilitates, that makes it easy for Gandhi to announce his arrival on the public sphere. And in the second half of the paper, I'm going to look at the discursive space. I'm going to look at the way Hindi periodicals and Hindi books anticipated his presence and how they pioneered a new style of history writing. Gandhi's arrival was preempted and was facilitated by a new style of history writing, a style of history writing which was popularized by Hindi periodicals such as Hans and Madhuri and Pratap and Abhyuday, Malvi's Abhyuday, Ganesh Shankar Vidyarthi's Pratap. So the style of history writing, I'm arguing, was popularized by periodicals, was popularized by a set of historians who who in a sense, in a very strict sense, were also literary critics. Characters who were extremely popular, authors who were very popular, who wrote books on history, who wrote books on literature as well, and who cannot be who resisted easy categorization, who the kind of categories we have, academicians have. So somebody is historian, somebody is literary critic. Those kind of categorizations he resisted, though although now we have moved decisively in the realm of interdisciplinarity. Yet it was their styles of writing and their engagements uh, uh, suggest that they breach not just the boundaries between a historian and literary critic, but at times they somehow tend to confuse history with literature. And we are looking at a set of periodicals and a set of historians and a set of publication houses that emerged around 1915, between 1915 and 1920s, that took it upon themselves to produce books that were readily available, books that were not expensive, too expensive to buy. In fact, you will discover. I'll give that example. How the second edition of certain books, owing to the popularity of the first edition, or owing to the importance of the book, as some of as at times the publishers explain, were less expensive. So they were reprinted with reduced price. So you have these periodicals, these historians, and these publication houses, which are trying to create a new style of history, write a new version of history, uh, a popular history, a history that is accessible, that is readable, that uh, cannot be categorized strictly as a history, that is part history, part literature, part entertainment, as opposed to, so this is a form of history writing, as opposed to uh, the colonial historians of the Vincent Smith School of Historiography. Right, people who dismissed said India had no notion of history. Indians do not know how to write history. They may have legends, but where are the evidences? So India is a nation without history. And then there were other historians who wrote caste histories. So we are looking at if this is also the argument which Sumit Sarkar makes about the coexistence of multiple notions of history, the coexistence, the simultaneity of multiple ideas about history. So you have popular historians who do not discriminate between historical and literary facts. Uh, you have uh, colonial historians who dismiss India's attempt or India's claim to history prior to their arrival, of course. And then you have historians who were, in a sense, prodded or egged on by these colonial historians into writing histories. But when they try to write history, they end up producing caste histories, histories of caste. So Bhartendu Harishchandra writes Agarwalon ki Utpatti and Khatriyon ka Itihas, so the caste history. So these popular historians uh, uh, and the style of history writing, pioneered and popularized by periodicals, certain publication houses, and certain historians, popular historians, as opposed to colonial historiography, or the kind of historiography that was practiced or pursued in universities. Right, we have quite a few universities by 1915 in India, uh, and the kind of histories that were focused on caste lineages. Right, so you have these three histories, and the first history historians or history books or accounts of the first kind makes it possible for Gandhi, or anticipates Gandhi, or projects Gandhi as the futuristic hero, right, the hero that India needs. And finally, I'll illustrate my arguments with some examples culled from Pratap, examples from a couple of other books about Gandhi that were published between 15 and 20, or prior to his arrival or shortly after his arrival. So this is this broad structure of the paper, right? Uh, so in 1916, when Rajkumar Shukla of Champaran was invited to speak from Congress's platform in Lucknow, it was arguably the first instance in India when a peasant represented himself. It was quite unprecedented. Uh, Shukla lacked the oratory of lawyers, educationists, and editors who were known to wax eloquent during sessions of the 30-year-old party. Yet he made it apparent that his people desire Gandhi's personal intervention. The accounts of Gandhi's maiden activism in Champaran, as narrated in works of Rajendra Prasad, in Tendulkar, in works of Pattabhi Sitaramaya, in Diary of Rajkumar Shukla. Now it's been transcribed in Devanagari. It was originally in Kaithi, but now it's available in Devanagari. So, in the diary of Rajkumar Shukla, among others, suggest that peasants from a nondescript region of India chose an outsider over nationalist patricians. Right. So Gandhi was an outsider till 16. He had made just one appearance and offered a 5 minute speech, and tried to move a resolution which was quickly adopted, and then that's it. That was his whole engagement. That was all the engagement that he had with Congress till 60, right? Till that particular session. Uh, Till that session in Lucknow. So the peasants chose an outsider over the political heavyweights who were already in India. Gandhi knew nothing of the place and was still testing the waters, yet the farmers chose him over the other heavyweights. Who were these heavyweights? Then there was this Firoz Shah Mehta, whom Gandhi saw unscalable like Himalayas, right? To describe Gandhi, Firoz Shah Mehta in Gandhi's own words. By the way, Firoz Shah Mehta was the person who first used the term Mahatma for Gandhi. So Gandhi saw him, described him as unscalable like Himalayas. Then there was Tilak, whom Gandhi found unnavigable like an ocean, right? The very opposite of Gokhale, the extremist voice in the Congress. But when Gandhi arrives in India, he joined Gokhale and others in praising his effort and waxed eloquent about Gandhi's efforts in defending the dignity of Indians in South Africa. So there was Gokhale, there was Firoz Shah Mehta, uh, and then there was Annie Besant. Annie Besant, uh, inscrutable, like mystery. The Theosophist, she claimed that she was on a mission to rescue India, and a mission imputed to her by no less an authority than Rishi Agastya. So then there was Annie Besant, and then there was Chittaranjan Das, C.R. Das, unmovable like a mountain. But Gandhi hoped to be like Gokhale, right? So Gandhi Gandhi was clear about his role models. Uh, he felt closest to Gokhale, closest to his ideas. But having a role model doesn't mean, as C.F. Andrew uh, thought, that Gandhi would end up molding his career after the career of Gokhale and eventually join and serve servants of India society for the rest of his life. Uh, so when Gandhi arrives on the political scene in 1915, determined to stay and work in India, he manages to seize in less than 5 years a perceptible vacuum at the apex. So 15, when Gandhi arrives, there's kind of a vacuum, right? There's a vacuum, and the vacuum, uh, the space keeps expanding, and Gandhi very quickly occupies this space. Um, some of it was, of course, fortuitous. I mean, in a macabre sort of way. Within a month of his arrival in February 1915, Gokhale passed away. Later, hours before he was to launch non-cooperation movement in August 1920, Tilak also passed away. By 1919, BHU was well established and Malvi was too busy managing affairs of the university. So he, in a sense, withdrew from active politics. Uh, and so there was a vacuum. But the vacuum was also a result of clever political maneuvering. So Gandhi somehow managed India to reject Annie Besant in favor of Annie Besant's idea of home rule in favor of his idea of Swaraj. In 1902, when Gandhi made his second trip to India after going to South Africa, um, he goes to Banaras and he goes to meet Annie Besant. And Annie Besant was quite unwell. In fact, she was recovering, recuperating. And Gandhi describes that meeting as darshan, right? He was, in a sense, a devotee of Annie Besant, and he wanted her darshan. And little, there's little that we know about the content of that interaction, of the nature of that interaction, except that Gandhi went to meet her, and she was kind enough to agree to meet him, and that's how it ended. What they discussed, what transpired between the two, we know very little about that. So it was darshan. So Gandhi reaches out to Annie Besant in 1902 to seek her darshan. Uh, and in 1916, when Gandhi is invited by Malviya to speak at Banaras Hindu University, he was heckled by supporters of Annie Besant. And yet, a year later, in 1917, uh, Besant was heckled by Gandhi's supporters. So by 1917, Gandhi had made his, in a sense, although it's un-Gandhian to use this term, Gandhi would have disapproved of this term, conquest very clear. By 1917, he had established himself. So Annie Besant was nowhere around. Similarly, he got Congress to shelf C.R. Das's idea of council entry and reduced some, as some historians argue, a brilliant leader, a brilliant mind, and a brilliant leader of pan-Indian stature to a regional force. And some even say that Subhash Chandra Bose's lifelong complaint with Gandhi has its roots in the way Gandhi managed to bypass C.R. Das, who was Subhash Babu's mentor, just as Gokhale's was Gandhi's mentor. And yes, there was a lot of self-fashioning. So when Gokhale died, Gandhi shaved his head and walked barefoot for 21 days to observe the ritual period of mourning. His ascetic lifestyle endeared him to the masses, and yet much of it fails to explain the faith which the peasants from Champaran reposed in him. What made Gandhi an instant phenomenon? Of course, there was all of this. There was this vacuum, part of which circumstantial, part of which was careful maneuver, um, and then uh, and then there was self-fashioning. But still, there's something more to it. There's something more to it, and this is where I look at the ways of history writing and how writers at this point, particularly those contributing to popular periodicals or writing for popular press, and those who, in a sense, confuse the distinction between confuse in a positive way, right? Confuse in an affirmative way, right? Not I'm not using it in a pejorative sense. Uh, I'm using it. I think the purists who were writing after Winston Smith's school of historiography, I think they are the ones that I'm slightly dismissive of here. So these historians create conditions for Gandhi's arrival and his celebration and propagation of his ideas. I'll just stop here for a moment. And Sashwat, how much time do I have?
You still have about 15-20 minutes, so please go on.
15, 20 minutes.
Yes, sir.
Right. Okay. Good. Thank you. Um, right. So, yeah. So the answer lies in the way his arrival was preempted, announced, and celebrated in the public sphere, and in different modes of writing, particularly history writing. Uh, This is my hypothesis, and I've attempted to test it by examining in the public sphere of the first 2 decades of the 20th century through the preeminent journalist of the period, Ganesh Shankar Vidyarthi. Vidyarthi had apprenticed under Vidyarthi edited a periodical called Pratap, very influential, very popular. At the peak of its popularity, it had 9,000 subscribers, quite a lot, right? Given the rate of literacy and the transportation and the availability of the postal services, right? So 9,000 was a huge number. He edited a weekly named Pratap, launched in 1913 from Lucknow. Now, surveying the motley of Hindi public spheres published till the late 19th century, one gets the impression that in spite of 1857, the oppressive regime of Lord Lytton, the Vernacular Press Act of 1878, and several points of concurrences, there was a general ambiguity when it came to defining the idea of jati. What do we mean by jati? Right? They concurred. There was a what what is the definition of jati which these periodicals or these history books were trying to address, right? There was a notion of jati which meant caste, uh, which was very clear to people like Bhartendu Harishchandra, who were writing histories of the kind I just described for you, Agarwalon ki Utpatti, Khatriyon ka Itihas, right? Those kinds of histories. But then the kind of jati which the periodicals were speaking to, these periodicals were trying to imagine, that was largely indeterminate, and this indeterminacy uh, uh, was quite advantageous. This flexibility, right, allowed the nationalists and allowed these editors, many of whom were engaged in the nationalist movement, to manipulate it, to tweak it at different junctures to suit the needs of the nationalist movement. Uh, they concurred on the economic critique of colonialism and the Golden Age myth, even though the partition of Bengal and the ensuing events compelled the public sphere to adopt a more militant stance. The idea of Nagrik or a citizen was yet to take roots, right? So, Nagrik or citizen, right? That definition was largely indeterminate. For the idea of community, they invoked a loosely defined term, jati. The fluidity was a great enabler. It generally implied caste or faith. However, at the beginning of the First World War, the idea of jati becomes more inclusive. So this is the time around which Gandhi is coming, right? This is 1914, 1915, the time when Gandhi arrives in India. However, at the beginning of the First World War, the idea of jati becomes more inclusive and acquires new connotations. This may be attributed to the Home Rule League and Tilak's grand tour across India. We know that Tilak toured India and to promote his Home Rule League, and that, in a sense, may have created a sense of a national jati, a Rashtriya jati, including Pratap. The Grand Tour, which had deep impact on the Hindi public sphere, and including Pratap. So now we are beginning to speak of a Bharatiya Jati, right? This Bharatiya Jati, which is celebrated in the periodicals. In Pratap, Vidyarthi uses it for a variety of reference. So Pratap, in this periodical, Pratap weekly, this was a weekly, Pratap uses the idea of Jati for a variety of reference, and as I suggested, tweaks it, changes it, redefines it, recasts it uh, whenever, whenever it suits the needs of the nationalist movement. For example, in its report on the Komagata Maru episode, Jati is used for both Sikhs and Indians. Equally worth noticing is the Persian, yeah, and then at times the membership of Jati is extended to the entire diaspora. Pratap envisages a grand Indian community that is truly international, diversified, and yet essentially united. Ever since its inception, the weekly followed very closely the struggles of Indians in South Africa. Reports with captions such as Ghor Sangram and Bhishan Atyachar give the impression that for Vidyarthi, the struggle in South Africa was as vigorous and significant as the one in India. It is in this context that Pratap first registers Gandhi. So he's championing the cause of Bharatiya Jati outside Bharat, right? So by being the leader of the diaspora, right, he becomes the champion of a newly emerging notion of jati, a newly emerging connotation of jati, which is a pan-Indian community, a pan-Indian jati, the Bharatiya jati, right? Uh, Reports, it is in this context that Pratap first registers Gandhi. This internationalism of jati acquires another dimension with the presence of Indians at places such as America. If South Africa was the site of challenge and struggle, the vibrant social life in America held out promises which were outside any exploitative system. An article by Lala Hardyal. So Lala Hardyal. So there's another. So this jati. So there's the pan-Indian jati, then there is the diaspora, the diaspora in duress in South Africa, and then there's this diaspora in America, which is a liberal society, which is an emancipatory society. And Lala Hardyal maintains regular correspondence with Pratap, and he writes about life in America. He urges Indians in America to join public movements there, and he invites Indians in India to learn from the struggles and the political and the social vibrancy of life in America. So then there's another definition of jati, right? An enabling jati, a jati in duress, and then the Bharatiya jati. By integrating Indian jati with all those who were struggling for, and then this jati, Indian jati, is at some point also integrated with nationalities elsewhere that were also fighting the colonial regimes, right? So South Africa and Ireland, they also, in a sense, uh, uh, provide a more expansive definition to the idea of jati, which these periodicals and these historians and these publication houses that I mentioned were invoking. As the definition of jati evolves, the public sphere progresses from provincialism to nationalism and finally to internationalism. If Gokhale and Lal Lajpat Rai were the vanguards of the movement within India, Gandhi was championing India's cause away from home. Upon his return to India, he bridges the two worlds. But disseminating the Mahatma in a manner that reaches the likes of Rajkumar Shukl was still a challenge. Projecting a secular hero was difficult because throughout the 19th century, uh, until the first decade of the 20th century, as the historical narratives were anchored primarily to caste and region. In the late 19th and early 20th century, a number of caste-specific periodicals were launched of the kind that I mentioned: Kayast Samachar, Kayast Vyavhar, Gurjar Samvad, Khatri Hitkari, Pandit, Kurmi Samachar, etc. These periodicals were brought forth to mobilize members of the community and as forums of advocacy of communal interest. However, most of these periodicals were short lived and struggled for acceptance and readership beyond the immediate community, which is well understood. For the same reason, they couldn't project heroes or symbols which could transcend narrow affiliations of caste and region. So it was difficult for these caste centric periodicals and histories to imagine a hero who would have national appeal and who can transcend the boundaries of caste and region. For the Hindi, if Hindi public sphere was to publish, it had to break free from these uh, these uh, these these parochial boundaries. were the communities in India to compete with the British, they needed a history as scientific as the latter. Such colonial speculations prompted recasting of caste history and regional and filial accounts and activated search for a new hero. In most of such attempts, history was constructed using myths, folk tales, etc. These initial forays in history writing lacked a national character since they were constructed primarily to validate illustrious lineages of the kind that I discussed. Uh, Bhartendu Harishchandra in 1870 produces Agarwal ki Utpatti and Khatriyon ki Utpatti. Bhartendu's accounts of Agarwal, which draws upon oral narratives and Bhavishya Puran, builds an extended family tree that includes Lord Krishna as well as Raja Todarmal, the revenue minister of Emperor Akbar. Likewise, the history of Khatris too is fashioned with Guru Granth Sahib and Bhavishya Puran. To some extent, Bhartendu's writing, and this is another argument, that these caste histories bear a cyclical relationship with the colonial accounts. Uh, with works of Indologists and Orientalists such as H.D. Colebrook, James Mill, James Todd, James Prinsep, Wilson, etc. While on the one hand, accounts such as Agarwalo ki Utpatti were shaped and inspired by earlier Indologists, on the other hand, they provided fodder and catalyzed works of later Indologists as well. So there's a cyclical reinforcement. So caste histories feed on these colonial historiography, and colonial historiographers in turn, right, draw from caste histories. So we had to, in a sense, break free from this cyclical arrangement. If accounts in the 19th century were based on caste and region, in the 20th century, communities were no longer confined to location. This was another problem. In 20th century, communities, the migration and the mobility was enhanced, and people could move from one place to another. So, defining a community in terms of region, strictly in terms of region, was becoming a problem of sorts. On account of migration and decline of feudal aristocracy, the rural societies had become unstable. Migrants, diaspora, and even geographically dislocated co-descendants could no longer identify with regionally circumscribed caste histories. Most of 19th century histories, with their twin preoccupations with caste and region, frustrate attempts to project protagonists and heroes who could be acceptable to the geographically dispersed members of the same caste, let alone garner a pan-Indian acceptability. Right, and this is a point which Partha Chatterjee also makes, and literary historian Shishir Kumar Das also makes, that the 19th century histories, because they were tied down to region and caste, made it impossible for the nationalists to project or imagine a pan-Indian hero. Right. The strongest censure of caste and regional histories uh, appears in the writings of popular historians such as the Arya Samaji historian Jayachandra Vidyalankar. Now, we don't read Vidyalankar anymore, but he was extremely popular, as were two other historians whose works I'll briefly mention. One is Ramnath Suman, and the other is Chatur Sen Shastri. Right, and all three of them wrote for these popular presses. So, Ramnath Suman wrote for Sasta Sahitya Mandal, Chatur Sen Shastri wrote for Gandhi Hindi Granthalay, right? All these periodicals, all these publishers, publication houses established to propagate Gandhi's ideas, established to make books accessible and readable, and written in a style that was readable. Uh, Vidyalankar wrote for periodicals like Pratap, Prabha, Madhuri, and often published with Hindustani Academy, Allahabad. Right? So there is Hindustani Academy, Allahabad, there is Gandhi Hindi Granthalaya, and then there is Sasta Sahitya Mandal, and there are others as well. The term extra academic, which I use to define the kind of writing or the style of writing that Vidyalankar pioneers, is to suggest that owing to their readability and low price, such works were not only popular but also offered perspectives different from those of academic historians like Vincent Smith, Jadunath Sarkar, and R.C. Majumdar. Uh, uh, Hindustani Academy of Allahabad, like Sasta Sahitya Mandal of Delhi, published low-priced Hindi books on economics, history, literature, etc. These books were usually free from academic jargons and were therefore accessible to average readers. The preface to Vidyalankar's book questions the politics of, in one of his books, he questions the politics of Vincent Smith's school of historiography. He also dismisses the kind of histories that were written with caste and region as the twin prerogatives. So he pioneers a new style of writing, popular, readable, accessible, cheap in terms of its price, uh, slightly entertaining, and which made it possible for history or Indian historians to think in terms of a futuristic hero, a pan-Indian futuristic hero. For Indian historians like Vidyalankar, their the greatest source of their worry was distortion of history in school textbooks, a dominion over which they had little control. Vidyarthi too uh, opposed was opposed to the academic historians who perpetuated colonial knowledge structures through textbooks. In 1920, in 1920s, his critique of colonial historiography was serialized as Bharatiya Schoolon mein Itihas ki Pustake, textbooks on history in Indian schools. In an essay titled Bharatiya Itihas ki Bangi, or the Fabric of Indian History, he discredits the truth claims of travelogues, Indologists, Perso-Arabic darbars, and caste historians, and lambasts Indian historians for trivializing their own past. Vidyarthi writes, and I quote, if history were not to be all about chronicles of royal families, would they ever succeed in writing a realist history of India? Besides, on account of their inability to grasp the distinctiveness of other civilization, they resort to irrational explanations. Some time back, seeing the sandal smeared forehead of an Indian woman, an American lady remarked that blood. It was blood spilled by a brick attack on the woman by her husband. The episode is quite ordinary. However, the ordinary things have their own significance. So Vidyarthi and Vidyalankar, they feel that the kind of histories and the kind of interpretation that were being offered by academic historians who were following in the footsteps of Vincent Smith's School of Historiography, by Vincent Smith and the other Indologists and Orientalists, by those historians who wrote caste history, was counterproductive, was in a sense distorting Indian reality, and that they needed something radically different. Uh, at the time when disciplinary boundaries were all too amorphous, almost everything could pass off as Sahitya. The jargon ridden and the austere language of academic historians wouldn't have sustained the interest of average readers of Pratap. A review of England Ka Itihas, published in September, and this review illustrates the kind of reservations Vidyarthi and Vidyalankar and Chatursen Shastri and Ramnath Suman had about the kind of histories that were produced or being taught in schools and universities, or were being written by Indologists uh, or caste historians. A review of England Ka Itihas, this history of England, published in September 1923 issue of Madhuri, complains that by excluding maps and glossary of certain English expressions, the translator hasn't factored in the little knowledge that an average Hindi readers possess about English. Another review of the book, titled Prachin Bharat Mein Prajatantra, must have been a popular book because I saw two reviews of it in the periodicals, argues that, and this reviewer argues that history shouldn't just instruct, but it should also be manoranjak or entertaining. So manoranjan was something which was lacking in all these histories as well. Babu Ramdin Singh's Bihar Darpan, 1822, exemplifies perhaps one of the earliest attempts to glorify modern heroes, right? So these histories were boring, these histories were jargon ridden, these histories were reductionist. At times they ended up distorting Indian realities, as Vidyarthi suggested in that example of a woman with her with her forehead smeared in sandalwood. And they also could not project secular heroes. Now, uh, the academic historians, and I'll take about 5 7 minutes to just conclude. Uh, Academic historians who operated from schools and universities persisted with earlier trends in historiography and did not subscribe to the notions of a new and emancipatory culture of a new hero. In fact, uh, uh, Ramchand Shukla, and some of you know him, Ramchand Shukla wrote the first history of Hindi literature. He was based in Banaras Hindu University, and like most literary critics, he was also a historian and a keen observer of the nationalist movement. And he did not like these new histories that were being written, and neither the new heroes that they were projecting. And he speaks dismissively of them in one of his writings, and he says uh, that he admires the feudal mobility in which a zamindar could become a peasant and vice versa, and he questioned those Hindi periodicals which operated from British India, resented though Border Bazaar opinion, right? That is the opinion of Border Bazaar. Some of you would know is a place in Calcutta. Marwadis lived there, and Marwadis were promoting Hindi and Hindi periodicals. Matwala was published from Border Bazaar. Matwala, that was edited by at some point it was edited by Surikant Tripathi Nirala. It was coming from it was from Border Bazaar. Later, Banarsi Das Chaturvedi brought out Vishal Bhardwaj from Border Bazaar. So he was referring to his dismissive of the Marwadis, he was dismissing of the new historians, he was dismissive of the new kind of histories, and he was largely dismissive of this new anti-feudal ethos or this democratic uh, din as he at times saw it. It may be argued that it was in the public sphere and through popular historians like Vidyalankar that desire for a history of and a futuristic hero who could transcend the caste and regional boundaries was expressed. An essay titled Jivani or Jivan Lekhan, which was first published in September 1935 issue of Madhuri and subsequently in October 1935 issue of Hans, possibly by Premchand. Possibly this essay was written by Premchand himself. Uh, urges historians to write accounts of those greats who hold out a promise to the future generations, right? Not the old figures, but the ones who have something to offer to the future generations, to India as it attempts to define itself uh, as opposed to the colonial regime. Um, Yeah, written by Premchand, the essay argues that the subject of biography should be harbinger of a new era, an advocate of revolution of thoughts, an architect of the future. And this is something we see in the way. And now I'll give you two very quick examples of how Gandhi's arrival was described in these periodicals and in these writings. I'll give you two examples from Pratap and maybe a couple of examples from books. Just sample them for you, not go into detailed analysis. Just sample them for you. In January 11, in the 11th January 1915 issue of Pratap, the year, the month that Gandhi arrives, two poems were published celebrating his return. One of which was by Bharat Mata herself. It was captioned Bharat Mata ki or se. Gandhi ji ka swagat Bharat Mata ki or se. Titled Mahatma Gandhi ka swagat Bharat Mata ki or se or Welcome to Mahatma Gandhi from Mother India. The poem prays for his longevity and hopes that his leadership will help the country wade through troubled waters. Another poem titled Shubh Kamna or Well Wishes calls him Kalyug Ka Arjun and hopes that the country would soon earn its redemption. The poem are accompanied by photograph of Gandhi in which he is seen dressed as a coolie in South Africa. The newspaper describes that photo as a gift to its readers. In the second issue of Pratap, published on 16 November 1913, Gandhi is introduced to readers as Karamveer, right? And I'll give you two examples from books that were published around this time. I think I can show one of the books to you. Uh, this was published in 1917. I think you can see it. It's called Satyagraha or Asahyog, right? This book was published in 1917. So as Gandhi is coming to his return to India, it is important to explain his methods to the people because people do not know. Not many people in India could read, and not many people in India knew what Satyagraha meant. So there were these publication houses. This is Gandhi Hindi Pustak Bhandar, right? Based in Bombay. It brought out these books to popularize Gandhi's ideas and Gandhi's views, and these were extremely inexpensive. These books were extremely inexpensive. Maybe another book. I'll show you a couple of other books. This is a book called महात्मा गांधी उनकी जीवन गाथा और जीवन के भिन्न भिन्न पहलू. And look at the ways in which Gandhi is described in this book. This book came out in 1917. Uh, तपस्वी गांधी, राइट, गांधी द एसेटिक, तत्वज्ञानी के रूप में, समाज परिष्कारक के रूप में, लेखक और कलाकार गांधी, दीन बंधु गांधी, कतिपय स्मरणीय प्रसंग, जीवन तालिका, right? So this is how Gandhi is celebrated, right, as a hero, as a future force. And finally, one example from maybe Pratap. I sampled a couple of articles that were published in Pratap. I'll show you one book which was published by uh, Pratap Karale, that is Pratap Press. This was first published. This is the photo that was published. Uh, can you? I hope some of you can. Sashwat, can you see this photo?
Yes, yes, sir.
So this was published in the issue that I described to you, January 1915 issue. Uh, and between the first print of this book was published in 1917, and by 1922 it had already run into the seventh print. Uh, and look at what the publisher has to say about the relevance of the book. Um, I'll just uh, I'll just end here, Sashwat. Maybe just read a few lines from the book, from the preface, and then conclude. I've already concluded. I'm just offering you some examples for fun. Uh, यह पुस्तक उस महात्मा की लिखी हुई है जो न केवल सदा देश और जाति के नाम पर कारागार को अपना पूज्य देवालय मानता है. This book is about a Mahatma and by a person who believes that the prison is his temple. मानता रहा है, जिसका जन्म दुखियों के दुख दूर करने और निर्बलों की सहायता के लिए हुआ है. Who is born to salvage the oppressed and give power to the powerless. अन्यायियों को बदला लेने के लिए भी हुआ है, right? To teach a lesson to the oppressors. लेकिन बदला लेने का उपाय कुछ और है. But his methods of avenging is quite different. And then it says, संस्करण में इस पुस्तक का मूल्य 8 आने रखा गया था पहले संस्करण में, किंतु इस विचार से कि इस पुस्तक का जितना अधिक प्रचार हो उतना ही अच्छा है, और तब भी हो सकता है जब पुस्तक सस्ती हो. अतः कागज आदि की इतनी महंगी होने पर भी, and this is the interwar year, right? Paper was extremely expensive, and yet the publisher decides to reduce the price from 8 आने to 4 आने. मूल्य कम कर दिया गया है. हम आगे कागज आदि के मूल्य में कमी होते ही और भी सस्ती संस्करण निकालेंगे. अंत में हम महात्मा गांधी के अत्यंत कृतज्ञ हैं कि इन्होंने इस पुस्तक के प्रकाशन की हमें सहर्ष आज्ञा दे दी. So that's my presentation to you. Maybe a quick recap. So I argued that Gandhi's arrival in 1915, uh, uh, it was facilitated by some circumstantial factors. There was a vacuum which he could quickly occupy, but it was also anticipated, and his arrival was also bolstered and given a huge impetus by the periodicals, the Hindi periodicals, and historians who were contributing articles to these periodicals, or were also publishing books from Hindi Pustakalay or Sasta Sahitya Mandal or Hindi Academy Allahabad, who were writing in opposition to colonial historiographers, in opposition to the academic historians like Jadunath Sarkar or R.C. Mujumdar, and also in opposition to the caste historians, right? And it is so this history, it is in these pages that we see the arrival of a truly futuristic hero. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Choubey, for your lecture. I think we often wonder about the reasons which account for Gandhi's immense popularity upon his arrival in India. And I think your talk, in a way, has very lucidly summed up for us, for our benefit, some of those reasons which actually made him popular. And that too by looking at a very clear and concrete aspect of history. I mean, you did talk about the print culture, the publishing industry, and so on. So, thank you so much for the talk. Can we take a few questions now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, so there's one question which is also linked to a comment, which is, I think, related to Gandhi being addressed as Mahatma by Firoz Shah Mehta. So, one question is, could you mention the context in which, or the year or the context in which Firoz Shah Mehta addresses him as the Mahatma? And then there's another comment which is related to this question, and there's a reference to Ramachandra Guha's biography of Gandhi, and the comment mentions that Guha attributes this. I mean, Guha argues that Gandhi was first addressed as the Mahatma by, I think, Pranjivan Mehta. So there are many names who are, who are supposed to have called Gandhi Mahatma for the first time. So it seems that there's some kind
I
of
think
confusion over that.
I'm I think I'm not the right person to reflect on that. I don't know maybe enough about that history, that period. or I think I'm not in a position to clearly decisively tell the person who was the first person. Guha can also be right. I've also read somewhere some say Tagore was the first person who called him Mahatma. So I think that debate has doesn't have too much to offer, except that who was the first person. Maybe it can work wonderfully as a GK quiz, but uh, or maybe it has something to offer. But unfortunately, I don't think I can comment on that, Sashwat.
Thank you, sir. The next question
Nothing
is
to.
by Shikha, which is could you elaborate a bit more on the critique of Gandhi offered by academic historians such as Jadunath Sarkar and others? I think you did talk about it, but a bit more on that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Uh, See, academic historians, uh, to them, Gandhi's erudition and Gandhi's methods, and most importantly, I'll give you an example, which will perhaps illustrate how the university bred, university educated people, especially who claimed a certain kind of intellectual sophistication, thought of Gandhi. Uh, when he returns to India, there's a reception party in his honor in Bombay, and Jinnah is one of the speakers at the reception party. And Jinnah, while others express great hopes about Gandhi and what he does, Jinnah points out to the fact that he uh, he has left a project incomplete in South Africa, and in a sense insinuates that that might be the future of Gandhian of plans in India. And he says that although he is here and we are happy, but the South Africans and the Indians in South Africa have no one to take care of themselves, no one to lead them anymore. So we do not know what's going to happen. So he insinuates that perhaps his project in India would be a failure, just as his mission in South Africa was a failure. Uh, so this is kind of resentment we see in academic historians about Gandhi. With Ramjan Shukla, the one I mentioned, he writes about Gandhi and he rejects Gandhi in relation to his critique of the caste culture, right, of the Baniya culture, of the mercantile culture in India. The essay is called Non-Cooperation and Non-Mercantile Culture in India. That was also the case with Jadunath Sarkar. They believed in a certain teleology of history, a certain way of unfolding events, and Gandhi somehow did not fit into their schemes. They were also dismissive at times of these books that were celebrating Gandhi. That's the reason no historian today speaks of Vidyalankar, although Vidyalankar pioneered a new style of writing, is extremely popular, but no historian today speaks of Vidyalankar, no one speaks of Ramnath Suman or Chatushen Shastri. So they perhaps had doubts about his methods, his eccentricity, perhaps that put some of the people off. And there were also contradictions, immense contradictions in Gandhi. For example, when he sets out to India in 1915, before that he goes to England to meet Gokhale, and he extends his support. Till that point, he was a loyalist, and he extends his support to the British war effort, and that confuses many historians, uh, many academicians, and many of his own friends. And I think there's this novelist from South Africa. I'm unable to recall her name. Guha writes about her. Guha writes about this novelist that she wrote a letter to Gandhi and said, I mean, your methods are theoretically so fragile. You claim to be non-violent, and here you are supporting the British war effort. Uh, Now, Guha also says that Gandhi's response to that novelist is unknown, but Gandhi said something to the effect to the other people who objected to his support to the British war effort, particularly his cousin, that by virtue of being in London, which is protected by the British Navy, he is, in a sense, a participant in the British violence. And because he is eating there, I think he should return the favor and support their cause. And he just wanted to raise an ambulance corps, just as he had done in the Boer War. He said that I'm nursing people, I'm not firing bullets. So my methods are still very clear. Still very clear in my head about what I'm doing. So perhaps this is my speculation. This is how I see. Perhaps it is this his resistance to easy theorization. As academicians, we like to see things being theorized. We like formulations that we can work with. We do not like indeterminacy, right? We like things to be extremely concrete, to be spelled out with clarity. In Gandhi, we see a lot of indeterminacy, and that, in a sense, is enabling. It makes uh, writings on Gandhi, I mean, hundreds and thousands of writings on Gandhi popular, right? There are so many works already, and many more will come. And it is perhaps this indeterminacy which frustrates easy categorization, which made academic students like Jadunath Sarkar suspicious of Gandhi, suspicious of his project, or maybe whether his project will reach a fruition or not. Yeah.
Thank you for the response, sir. Manas has a question, which I think brings history and literature together in some senses, which is that when is it that we see Gandhi appearing as a character in Hindi fictional works, and could you shed some light on Gandhi appearing in fiction, in Hindi fictional
Uh,
works?
I do not know Manas the very first instance, but I know a few examples and important ones. One I can immediately tell you is from 1930, the year he launches his second major movement in India. And this is the year when Premchand launches his magazine Hans. And he ensures that the magazine is launched in the same month as Gandhi launches his movement. And he in that particular issue, in the inaugural issue of Hans, which is launched at a time when Gandhi is launching his movement, he writes a story called Julus. And in Julus, he creates a Gandhian character, and the Gandhian character, in a sense, leads explains the need for the movement, but the Gandhian character also reflects on his previous movement, the one in 1922, right, which was cut short after Chauri Chora. So in the story Julus, through this Gandhian character, Premchand offers justification for the terminated movement of the 20s, and prepares the ground, anticipating Gandhi's project in times to come. So that's one example that I can think of. But the use of Gandhian ideology and the use of Gandhian figure in fiction, uh, I think it was explored by authors such as Premchand and Janendra Kumar Agye to some point, to explore a motive. This motive is quite dominant in Hindi literature particular, which is the change of heart narrative, right? That how a person gradually arrives at a point where he experiences a change of heart, and gradually reforms his ways, mends his ways. So that's a dominant motive in which Gandhi is explored. Of course, we also have example of Panishwanath Renu and his writing, which critiques and ridicules Gandhi. A popular Bengali work that deals with Gandhian figure would be Dhurai Charit Manas by Satyanath Bhaduri. So these are some of the works. I cannot establish the chronology, but this is the dominant trend. So Gandhi, in the initial years, the Gandhian figure becomes prominent. Through the Gandhian figure, the novelists and the writers and the storytellers reflect on the movement, on the possibilities of the movement, and most importantly, speculate on the possibility of change of heart. Right? Because that's what everyone wanted the Britishers to do, to undergo a change of heart and give India its freedom. So that's one dominant motive that is being explored. But after independence, of course, the fallacies of the Gandhian method and the fallacies of the Gandhi-like figure, or the innocence, or the juvenile innocence of the Gandhi-like figure, that becomes one of the motives most discussed in Hindi literature. Yeah.
We have, and I think this is the last question. We have a question by Aditya, and I think for our benefit, we might extend the question a little bit. And his question is on Gandhi's critique of socialist ideology, but I think for our this might be a little off the mark. So for our purpose, maybe we I mean, what were some of the, or how did the socialists in the period you're looking at, 1920s and so on, how did they respond to Gandhi at this point? Do we have any responses at this
Not
stage,
too many
or it's
socialists
not?
around, Sashwat, right? Not too many socialists. The socialist movement emerges in a big way in the 30s, no? So there are not too many socialists around. In fact, the first piece on Marxism in Hindi comes out in 1930s by Rahul Sankritayan, followed by another book on Marxism by Yashpal. So not too many socialists around to critique Gandhi of this particular phase. the first few years and the initial periods, only mostly uh, uh, the 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 ones who did not support Gokhale and his moderate ways, they were the ones who critiqued Gandhi mostly. Because he also spoke from, in the initial years, 1915 to 20. He speaks at Banaras Hindu University. He addresses the sessions of the Muslim League. So, in a sense, he's experimenting with India. He's reaching out to India. He knows Kathiawada, he knows Bombay, he knew a little bit about Banaras. He had accidentally stopped at Allahabad in 1902 or some there around, whenever he had come to India. So he knew India in bits and pieces, didn't know India in its entirety. And this is the time when he's engaging with India. He's trying to engage with different factions. He's trying to engage with all the opponents. In fact, during his very first visit to India, when he misses his train and had to spend a day at Allahabad, he reaches out to the editor of Pioneer, and the Pioneer's editor was known as a notorious figure. He was known to write against the nationalist movement and was a critique of the Congress. And he reaches out to him and tells him that I just wanted to interact with you and just get to know what you think of me and my methods, and hope that at some point in your newspaper you'll give some space to my ideas as well. And that's when he thinks of writing the green pamphlet. So at this point, Gandhi is engaging with his opponents, and he's not really giving much reason to critique. That, although that's something I'll have to look into, because if there were socialist critiques of Gandhi around the 1920s, between 15 and 20, then those would be early socialists in India, and I'll have to look into that history. But socialist, as we all know, I mean, come around 19 late 20s, early 30s, so no socialist around. But Gandhi's again, Gandhi's primary contention with the socialists was their methods, because he has seen the way the movement unfolded in Russia. In, so he was against the creed of violence, and that perhaps made him uh, suspicious of the socialists and the communists. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for patiently answering each of the question with such clarity, and thank you for the
I
very
could not give
insightful talk.
a few apologies, Sashwat. I mean, these are things again, I mean, who was the first person to call Gandhi Mahatma? These are fact check things you can do on Google. So we have Google and books for that. Also, the chronology of socialists in India. That would be an interesting, in a sense, prehistory of socialist ideas in India, because the best known socialists, the Socialist Party in India and the Communist Party of India, all of that comes out in 30s, and Nehru is the best known socialist and he's Gandhi's closest ally around this time. So
Yes,
they have
I
created it.
Yes, and if I may just very quickly add, I think there's this one remark that Gandhi makes, perhaps in the early 30s, where he says that I know there are, I mean, he says perhaps there are some four types of socialists in India, and none of them have any idea about what is real India. So he was certainly at one point very critical of them, but of course, like you I think rightly mentioned, he did have a good number of socialist colleagues who even though they disagreed with him, but had great respect for him, and it was mutual in so many ways. Uh, so thank you so much, sir, for the lecture, and I would also like to thank our viewers who joined us today, despite the fact that this is for at least for students. This is holiday season and so on. I mean, in India, this is the time when people wouldn't really involve themselves in academic activities. So I'm sincerely thankful to our audience. We will be back with the last lecture of this international webinar series on the morning of 29th October, which is day after tomorrow. Professor Paroma Roy of University of California, Davis, will be speaking on a topic which might interest many of us, which is Gandhi and food. So she will be speaking on Gandhi's dietary practices and the politics of Gandhi's dietary practices. So I hope all of you will join us again. And once again, I would like to thank Gautam sir for finding time for us for this wonderful talk that you delivered today. Thank you so much, sir, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sashwat. Thank you, everyone.